Hey guys, Johnny here from Folha, and welcome back to another one of our episodes. Today we are finally going to be going over watering and how to maintain your indoor plants, how to water them correctly. We're going to start by talking about the basic watering needs, the different types of soil and how the soil reacts to watering. We're going to split the plants into three different groups. We'll start with plants that like to dry out completely, and then plants that like to dry out about 50% through, and then plants that like to stay evenly moist throughout. So to start off with, we're going to talk about the different soil types that we use with indoor plants and how they react differently to watering. For example, we sell a peat-based soil here, which is great. It's really great for indoor plants. You know, it's light, it's not heavy, it's not compact. You know, it's a really great soil to use for your indoor plants to keep your roots healthy. One thing you do need to know about peat soil is that if it is allowed to dry out completely, it does tend to be a little bit difficult to be able to soak it again and to get it wet again. You'll kind of water your plant, and then the top layer is going to be wet, but underneath it's going to be a little bit dry and crispy still. The same that happens with the sides. The water's kind of going to cascade down the sides of the pot, but then it's not necessarily going to soak through the whole root system. The other types of soil would be kind of a clay-based soil and then a wood chip, kind of wood bark-based soil. Those ones are a little bit easier when watering them because they take so long to dry out. So now when we think about the seasons and how plants will adapt to the seasons, so basically we have the growing season and the dormancy season. That's pretty much the only ones we focus on when we're talking about indoor plants. Obviously it's different all around the world, so plant care instructions do differ slightly, but here in South Africa our growing season starts from about September and ends in about March. And as you would know, that kind of shows that, you know, during the spring and summertime when the heat is up, it's a little bit more windy as well. You know, plants are drying out a lot quicker, so we will need to frequently water them. So our light levels are high throughout the day, and this is the time where our plants are going to go into their growing phase, hence why we call it the growing season. With the extended hours of light as well, your plants are going to be trying to grow as much as possible to get ready for their dormancy period. During this phase, you're going to want to water quite frequently, depending on the plant's needs. We're going to go through that in a second. And on top of that, you also want to be feeding your plants because they're going to be growing as much as possible, and you want to be supplementing that growth with a bit of food as well. Obviously, when we pot plants up, you know, we've taken them out of nature and they don't have dead and decaying branches and leaves that are kind of falling on the forest floor, decomposing and then passing on the nutrients, you know, like a nice little cycle. When we water our plants, we're actually rinsing out the nutrients constantly from the soil, so we need to be replacing it with some sort of food. But when we go into the winter season and it gets a little bit colder, it might not be as drafty or as hot, the water isn't evaporating as quickly, so we're not going to be watering the plants as much. And it'll actually be surprising how little we need to water them during winter. Now, when looking at some tools that you need to water, these are some things that I would suggest you have. A small skewer stick with some notches on it that you've made by just a pair of scissors or a knife, just so that you can stick it into the soil just to test how wet it is. If you pull it out and it's completely clean, then we know that the soil's dry and there's no soil sticking to there. If you pull it out and there's maybe two notches that have got some soil on it, then you know that wherever that reached, they've got a bit of wet soil under there. So the skewer stick is a really good option just to, you know, push it into the soil. It's kind of an easy way. It's not foolproof, however, because not all soil is going to stick to this thing. So then the alternative is to just use your finger, which is what I like to do, you know. Kind of be in touch with the soil, feel exactly what it's doing. What's going on in the top layer of soil could be very different to what's going on in the middle part, and especially the bottom. You know, we could have a very dry, crispy kind of layer on the top with a slight moist middle, and then soggy at the bottom, which we don't even know because we haven't felt the soil yet. So it's always best to try and use your finger, just push it in as deep as you can into the soil, just to feel the moisture levels, and then you should be able to tell if the plant needs water or not. The next thing would be a watering can, and you've probably seen these before as well. These are very popular indoor watering cans. They're great because they're easy to use, you know, they're light, they kind of pour themselves as well. You kind of just balance them on your finger there. Also have very nice measuring capabilities. So, for example, this one is 1.5 liters, and that kind of fits in well with your diluting requirements with your food. The thing I must add before we carry on is that a lot of people like to stick to schedules with watering, but, you know, as I've mentioned with you about the seasons, it's not an exact science. Depending on the wind, depending on the heat, evaporation changes. So never stick to a schedule and say, okay, well, I'm going to be watering every Sunday or every Monday or whatever, because it's always going to change. And that is how we get into the problem of overwatering, is when we stick to a schedule, because we're kind of just going off what we think. We're not testing the soil out, and it could be soggy, it could have not absorbed any of the water, and then you go and water it again and now it's overwatered, and it's very possibly going to die from root rot. There's also a blue mat moisture sensor. We kind of pop into the soil and it gives you a nice reading of how moist the soil is and if it needs to be watered or not. So now let's go through the actual routine and the specifics and little tips and tricks when watering our plants. I chose the macho fern because he seems like he needs a bit of water and I didn't want to overwater the others. He's got a nice big pot, so I'll show you exactly how to soak that nicely. So firstly, you can start with your stick and you can shove him in all the way down to the bottom. Kind of wiggle it around a little bit and then bring it up, and you can see he's moist by halfway. So you can see kind of the soil sticking all the way there, just until the last little bit. I do recommend you do this over something. I usually do it in the shower or in the bath, over a basin or whatever, but it is always recommended to kind of move your plants around when you water them so that you're never filling up the drip tray underneath, because that kind of allows soggy soil to happen and root rot. Take your drip tray, pop your plant on it, and let's go ahead and water it. So when you go ahead and water it, always just make sure that you're getting all the way around the pot. Kind of make sure that you've, getting in the sides, in the little corners, in the little bits, making sure that it's going all the way through and soaking into the soil. And now halfway through your watering, you should start to see the water seeping out of the bottom. That's when we know the water's reached kind of the end of the roots and it's getting all the way through the system. And because of the peat-based soil, which is what I explained to you about it drying out and not wanting to absorb water, give it a good soaking and then wait a little bit and then water it again after that. And when you water it the second time, you should notice that less water will come out the bottom because it's actually absorbing through and through. So now let's go into the different plants, into the different groups, and we're going to start now with the plants that are some of the easier care plants. So what I have here in front of me are 6 beautiful examples of plants that don't require a lot of water and ultimately don't require a lot of maintenance either. So we can start here with the ZZ plant or the Zanzibar gem. This is a very, very popular plant because it can take such low light levels, and also it only probably needs to be watered once a month, and it can be without water for up to 3-4 months, which is pretty amazing. And then we have one of our trailing plants, which is also quite nice because it's always good to have a trailing option that is easy care as well. So this is a Philodendron scandens Brazil. From what research will tell you, this guy likes to dry out almost 100%, but if I was you, I would let him dry out completely in between waterings because they just look their best when that happens. From my own experience, I've realized that their foliage just looks ultimately the best when they're just left to dry out, and then you give them a good soaking after that. We then have the Dracaena reflexa. This is the Song of India. It's a really beautiful, gorgeous, gorgeous plant, and this guy absolutely loves to dry out completely. Too much water and he'll start to rot very, very quickly. We have the Sansevieria grandis and then the Sansevieria trifasciata, otherwise known as mother-in-law's tongue. Very, very popular plant, also because they're so easy with their watering. And then lastly, we have a Aspidistra, or otherwise known as a cast iron plant. So the reason it got its nickname, cast iron plant, is because it's incredibly hard to kill. It's incredibly tolerable of a lot of situations. The history of this plant is old Victorian mansions. They kind of used to sit in dark foyers and entrance halls and kind of just be left to their side and touched every now and then. So these guys are pretty much on the same level as the ZZs and the Sansevierias. They can go quite a long time without water. Surprisingly enough, they look quite tropical, but they're actually not. But yeah, they're very, very tolerable to underwatering and low light situations as well. Now here are the examples of the plants that kind of like to dry out about 50% of the way. So that obviously means, yes, you can water it properly and you can soak it nicely, but then you must wait for it to dry out at least halfway down the pot before you water it again. So we have our macho fern, and then we have a different back here. I think this is the Alex, and then we have a Philodendron Salome. And now with our last category, the plants that like to stay evenly moist. You'll kind of notice that they are the most beautiful ones, they're the most unique ones, just because they're harder to take care of and they're harder to come by. But if you commit yourself to it and you give it exactly what it needs, it will be absolutely beautiful. So I'll start in the front with these guys. These are 2 of our Calatheas. We've got a few more in our stock, but I wasn't going to put them all on the tables. These guys, they like to stay constantly moist. When I say constantly moist, I don't mean soggy. So when you touch the soil, you should always just feel a little bit of moisture all the way around, but you should never be able to squeeze water out of the soil if you compress it between your fingers. I have the Spathiphyllum sensation. So this is very similar to the peace lily. It's the same family actually, but it just doesn't flower. So this guy, just like its flowering cousin, will actually start to wilt a little bit and he'll start to kind of droop if he doesn't have enough water. So he's really nice to show, and you'll notice that he'll start doing that when he dries out just a little bit. So it's a little bit touchy with its watering. It does like to stay evenly moist as well. It never likes to dry out. You will start to get browning tips if you let the plant dry out too much. So I just really wanted to show you this plant as well. This is a Coffea arabica, so an arabica coffee tree. Really cool, he's really awesome. He's got pretty fast growth, and you can see he looks a little bit like a Natal mahogany. And he kind of sits at the top of the list because he wants water every 2 or 3 days, sometimes even more. He really is quite thirsty and he likes to drink all the time. So if you don't water him enough and you don't give him that right amount of water, he'll start to get brown tips on here and that will never be able to recover. So always just make sure he's constantly wet throughout. He can be a little bit soggy, you can overwater him a little bit, but just make sure that you do give him enough and you do have proper drainage in the bottom of the pot as well. Okay guys, that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I did help out a little bit with giving you some tips and tricks for watering. Just remember that the ultimate problem with indoor plants and people is overwatering, so don't overwater your plants.